The courtroom laughed with him. She never laughed back. The sound echoed across the polished chamber as Ryan Morgan leaned comfortably in his chair, a confident smile spreading across his face. The divorce hearing had barely begun, yet he already looked victorious. Sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across rows of wooden benches filled with attorneys, assistants, and curious observers waiting for the morning docket to unfold. Ryan adjusted the sleeve of his expensive navy suit and glanced toward Claire Morgan as though she were nothing more than another item on the day's agenda. The woman sitting across from him did not look like someone preparing for a legal battle over wealth or status. She wore a simple cream-colored blazer, a modest blouse, and carried a worn leather folder resting quietly on her lap. No designer jewelry. No display of success. No attempt to impress anyone. To most people in the room, Claire looked like a woman about to lose everything. Ryan seemed eager to reinforce that impression. "Your Honor," he said before proceedings had fully settled into rhythm, "I think we can save everyone a lot of time today." A few people looked up. Judge Eleanor Hayes remained expressionless. "Mr. Morgan," she said evenly, "your attorney will have an opportunity to speak." Ryan nodded, but could not hide the amusement in his voice. "Of course." The smile never left his face. Across the aisle, Claire sat perfectly still. Her hands rested calmly on the folder. Her posture remained straight. Her face revealed nothing. To an outsider, she appeared detached, almost indifferent. Yet inside, memories moved quietly through her thoughts. 10 years. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of believing that loyalty mattered more than appearances. 10 years of helping Ryan build a company from a rented office above a small insurance agency into one of the fastest-growing regional logistics firms in the state. She remembered late nights reviewing budgets while he slept. Weekends spent organizing paperwork. Holidays interrupted by business emergencies. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile then, because she believed they were building a future together. Somewhere along the way, that future became his future. The courtroom doors opened briefly as another attorney entered. Papers shifted. Chairs moved. The hearing officially began. Ryan's attorney stood first. He was polished, experienced, and confident. The kind of lawyer accustomed to winning negotiations before they reached a judge. He outlined Ryan's position clearly. Ryan owned the company. Ryan controlled the assets. Ryan generated the income. Ryan deserved the majority of the marital estate. The presentation was smooth, professional, persuasive. Several observers nodded along. Claire listened without interruption. She neither objected nor reacted. Every few minutes Ryan glanced toward her, perhaps hoping to see frustration or anxiety. Instead, he found the same calm expression. It irritated him more than he expected. During a brief pause, Ryan leaned slightly toward his attorney and whispered something. The lawyer smiled. Moments later, he addressed the court again. "It is unfortunate," he said, "but sometimes one spouse becomes dependent on the success created by the other." A few quiet murmurs drifted through the room. Ryan looked pleased. Claire remained silent. Judge Hayes made several notes. Then she looked toward Claire's side of the courtroom. "Counsel?" she asked. Claire's attorney, Michael Bennett, slowly rose from his seat. Unlike Ryan's attorney, Michael did not rush. He adjusted his glasses, gathered a few documents, and approached the podium with unusual patience. "Your Honor," he said, "before discussing asset division, there are several matters the court should review." Ryan barely paid attention. He leaned back comfortably and crossed one leg over the other. To him, the outcome felt obvious. Claire had no company, no visible investments, no major business interests, no leverage. The hearing would simply formalize what he already believed, that she needed him far more than he had ever needed her. Michael placed a sealed folder on the podium. Judge Hayes noticed immediately. "What is that?" she asked. "Documentation recently delivered to our office," Michael replied. "Material relevant to Mrs. Morgan's financial position." Ryan laughed softly. The sound was impossible to miss. Several people turned toward him. "Financial position?" he repeated. "This should be interesting." Even the court reporter glanced up. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the folder resting in her lap. For the first time all morning, a faint emotion crossed her face. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Something closer to acceptance. As though she already knew a truth nobody else in the room had discovered yet. Michael handed copies to the clerk. Judge Hayes began reviewing the first pages. Her expression remained neutral at first. Then her eyes paused on a particular line. She looked back at the documents. Then again. Ryan noticed the change immediately. "Is there a problem?" he asked casually. Judge Hayes did not answer right away. Instead, she turned another page. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Even Ryan's attorney leaned forward slightly. Whatever the judge was reading had captured her full attention. Claire sat motionless. The sunlight continued moving across the floor. Somewhere outside, distant traffic hummed beyond the courthouse walls. Inside the courtroom, however, the atmosphere had changed. No announcement had been made. No revelation had occurred. Yet something unseen had entered the room. Judge Hayes finally looked up from the documents. Her eyes settled briefly on Claire. Then she turned toward Michael Bennett. "Counselor," she said carefully, "are these records verified?" Michael nodded once. "Every page, Your Honor." Ryan's smile weakened slightly. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared. And while nobody understood exactly what was hidden inside those documents, everyone could feel the same thing. The case they thought they were watching was not the case they were actually watching. Ryan Morgan could feel the atmosphere changing, even though nobody had explained why. Only minutes earlier, he had entered the courtroom completely certain of the outcome. The divorce was supposed to be a formality. A final signature. A legal confirmation that the chapter was over. Instead, Judge Eleanor Hayes continued studying the documents placed before her with a level of attention that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Across the room, attorneys who had been casually reviewing notes were now watching closely. The clerk paused her typing more than once to glance toward the bench. Even Ryan's own attorney seemed uncertain. Claire Morgan remained exactly as she had been since the hearing began. Calm. Quiet. Unshaken. Her hands rested lightly on the worn leather folder in her lap. Her expression revealed nothing. To anyone who did not know her, she appeared detached. But Claire was not detached. She was remembering. Long before courtrooms and attorneys entered her life, she had made a choice. A choice almost nobody understood. When she met Ryan 10 years earlier, she never told him everything about her family. Not because she wanted to deceive him. Because she wanted something real. Claire had grown up surrounded by wealth that never felt normal. Private schools. Investment advisors. Family trusts. Board meetings discussed at dinner tables. While other children talked about movies and sports, her relatives talked about acquisitions, stock performance, and corporate expansion. By the time she turned 21, she understood something many wealthy families never learned. Money attracted attention. But it did not always attract sincerity. Then she met Ryan. He was ambitious, energetic, and full of dreams. He spoke passionately about building something meaningful. He treated her with kindness. He laughed easily. Most importantly, he never knew who her family was. For the first time in years, Claire felt seen as a person rather than a financial opportunity. So she made a decision. She stepped away from her family's business world. She kept certain details private. She wanted a marriage built on trust, not balance sheets. For years, she believed she had succeeded. The memory faded as Michael Bennett adjusted several documents at the counsel table. Judge Hayes finally looked up. "Counselor," she said, "these records indicate substantial holdings connected to Mrs. Morgan." Ryan immediately laughed again, though the confidence behind it sounded weaker now. "There has to be some mistake." Nobody joined him. Judge Hayes returned her attention to the documents. "Mr. Morgan, I suggest you allow the process to continue." Ryan leaned back, but remained visibly irritated. Beside him, his attorney quietly requested a copy of the records. The clerk provided one. As the lawyer reviewed the first pages, his expression changed. He turned another page. Then another. Ryan noticed immediately. "What is it?" he whispered. The attorney did not answer right away. "I need to review this more carefully." Ryan frowned. That response alone was unusual. His attorney rarely looked surprised. Across the aisle, Claire watched sunlight move slowly across the courtroom floor. The same courthouse had processed thousands of divorces over the years. Thousands of stories ending. Thousands of people dividing homes, bank accounts, businesses, and memories. Yet her story felt strangely different. Not because of the money. Because she had never wanted any of this. She would have traded every asset connected to her family if it meant preserving mutual respect. Unfortunately, respect could not be inherited. It had to be chosen. And somewhere during the final years of their marriage, Ryan stopped choosing it. The shift had happened gradually. Small comments at first. Dismissive remarks disguised as jokes. Assumptions that his success belonged entirely to him. Invitations where he introduced her as an afterthought. Conversations where her opinions no longer mattered. None of those moments destroyed the marriage individually. Together, they slowly eroded it. Ryan interrupted her thoughts. "Your Honor," he said, forcing a smile, "with all due respect, Claire has never owned significant assets." Judge Hayes glanced toward him. "That appears to be incorrect." Silence followed. Ryan blinked. For the first time that morning, genuine uncertainty crossed his face. Michael Bennett rose calmly. "Your Honor, my client chose not to disclose certain family interests publicly during her marriage." Several people exchanged looks. Ryan stared at Claire. "Family interests?" The phrase sounded absurd to him. Claire had never spoken about family wealth. Never discussed corporate holdings. Never mentioned trusts or investment structures. The woman he married volunteered at community programs, organized charity events, and spent weekends helping local nonprofits. She never behaved like someone connected to immense financial power. That was precisely why nobody suspected anything. Judge Hayes continued reviewing the file. "These records reference Morgan's strategic holdings." The name hung in the air. A faint reaction moved through the courtroom. One attorney looked up immediately. Another quietly whispered to a colleague. Ryan noticed neither reaction. The name meant nothing to him. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She knew exactly what it meant. Morgan Strategic Holdings was not simply an investment company. It was the foundation of an empire built across generations. Real estate, technology, infrastructure, energy partnerships, international investments. Her family spent decades creating it. Yet she never wanted that legacy to define her life. Ironically, the one day she wanted it hidden most was the day it refused to stay hidden. Ryan leaned toward his attorney. "What is Morgan Strategic Holdings?" The attorney finally looked at him. This time, there was no confidence in his expression. Only concern. "Ryan," he said quietly, "I think we need to be very careful." Before Ryan could respond, Judge Hayes closed the folder and looked toward Michael Bennett. "Counselor," she said, I believe the court will require testimony regarding these holdings. Michael nodded once. We anticipated that, Your Honor. He reached for another sealed envelope resting beside him. Claire recognized it immediately. Her heart remained steady. The room, however, seemed to grow noticeably quieter, because whatever people believed they understood about Claire Morgan was about to become much harder to believe. The sealed envelope remained untouched for only a few seconds, yet those seconds seemed to stretch across the entire courtroom. Judge Eleanor Hayes watched as Michael Bennett placed the document carefully on the counsel table. Ryan Morgan could no longer disguise his uneasiness. Earlier that morning he had been smiling, laughing, acting as though the divorce was already settled. Now he sat forward in his chair, eyes fixed on the envelope, as though it contained answers he was not sure he wanted. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Conversations had stopped. Papers no longer shuffled. Even the spectators sitting quietly in the back rows seemed aware that something unusual was unfolding. Michael Bennett broke the silence first. Your Honor, he said calmly, before the court proceeds with property division, we request acknowledgement of additional information recently finalized through legal channels. Judge Hayes nodded. Proceed. Michael opened the envelope. Ryan instinctively glanced toward Claire Morgan. She remained composed. No smile. No satisfaction. No visible reaction at all. If anything, she looked tired. Ryan could not understand it. If she truly possessed some hidden financial advantage, why was she not enjoying this moment? Why was she not proving him wrong? The answer was simple. Claire had never come to court seeking victory. She came seeking closure. Michael removed several pages and handed copies to the clerk. As the documents circulated, Ryan's attorney reviewed them carefully. His expression darkened with every page. What is it? Ryan whispered again. The attorney inhaled slowly. I think we have a much larger situation than we realized. Ryan frowned. Stop speaking in riddles. The attorney looked at him directly. I am trying to understand it myself. Across the room, Claire's thoughts drifted backward once more. Not to wealth. Not to family businesses. To a conversation she had with her grandfather years ago. She had been 23. Freshly engaged. Excited about the future. Her grandfather sat with her on the porch of the family estate overlooking acres of rolling countryside. The evening sun had painted everything gold. He asked a simple question. Do you trust him? Claire answered immediately. Yes. Her grandfather smiled. Then build a life together. She remembered another question afterward. Should I tell him everything? The older man considered the thought for several seconds. Tell him when the information serves your relationship rather than your fears. At the time, the advice felt wise. Looking back now, she wondered whether anyone could truly predict the future. Because neither she nor her grandfather imagined that the greatest secret in her life would one day become evidence in a divorce courtroom. Judge Hayes interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Bennett, these records reference a trust structure. Yes, Your Honor. Established more than a decade ago? Correct. Ryan blinked. A decade ago. Before their wedding. Before their marriage even began. A small knot formed in his stomach. Wait, he said suddenly. What trust? Michael glanced toward him, but addressed the judge. The Morgan Family Preservation Trust. The name landed quietly. Yet several attorneys reacted immediately. One looked up from his notes. Another exchanged a knowing glance with a colleague. Ryan noticed again. For the second time that day, he felt as though everyone else understood something he did not. Judge Hayes continued reading. This trust lists Claire Morgan as primary beneficiary. Yes, Your Honor. Ryan stared at Claire. She met his gaze briefly. There was no anger in her eyes. No accusation. just calm acceptance. Somehow, that disturbed him more than resentment would have. "Claire," he said before thinking. "What is this?" Her voice remained soft. "Something I never expected to matter." Ryan laughed nervously. "Clearly it matters." She looked away. The response told him nothing. Michael stepped forward again. "The trust remained inactive in practical terms until recent legal transitions were completed." Judge Hayes nodded. "And those transitions have now been finalized?" "They have." Ryan's attorney closed the file and rubbed his forehead. The gesture alone alarmed Ryan. He had hired the man because nothing seemed to surprise him. Yet today's surprise appeared on nearly every page. The judge reviewed another section. "There are significant holdings connected to this structure." Michael answered carefully. "Yes." "Real estate?" "Yes." "Investment portfolios?" "Yes." "Private equity interests?" "Yes." Each answer increased the tension inside the room. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The confidence he carried into court was disappearing piece by piece. He remembered countless arguments during the marriage. Moments when he accused Claire of lacking ambition. Times he suggested she did not understand business because she preferred community work over corporate competition. Looking back, those memories suddenly felt different. Unsettlingly different. Judge Hayes set down one document and picked up another. "The valuation section appears incomplete." Michael nodded. "Because independent verification is still underway." Ryan seized on that statement immediately. "Then we do not actually know the value." Michael looked at him. "Not precisely." Relief flashed briefly across Ryan's face. It lasted less than a second. "Because the estimate continues changing upward." Silence followed. Even the air felt heavier. Ryan's relief vanished instantly. Michael turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, the court requested verification. The individual responsible for administering these holdings is present and prepared to testify." Judge Hayes looked toward the courtroom doors. "He is here?" "He is." Ryan followed her gaze. Every person in the room seemed to do the same. The doors remained closed for a moment. Then the bailiff stepped forward after receiving a quiet instruction. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She knew exactly who was about to enter. More importantly, she knew what his testimony would reveal. Not because she had hidden a fortune from Ryan. Because she had spent years trying not to let that fortune define her. The courtroom doors slowly opened. A distinguished older gentleman carrying a black leather portfolio stepped inside. The moment several attorneys recognized him, the room grew even quieter than before. And for the first time since the hearing began, Ryan Morgan felt something he had not expected to feel all day. Fear. The distinguished older gentleman walked toward the witness stand with the steady confidence of someone accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered them. His gray suit was perfectly tailored. His black leather portfolio remained tucked beneath one arm. Several attorneys sitting throughout the courtroom immediately recognized him. A few exchanged surprised glances. Others sat up straighter in their seats. Ryan Morgan noticed every reaction. Unfortunately, he still did not understand what they meant. Claire Morgan watched quietly as the man approached the front of the courtroom. Unlike everyone else, she had known him most of her life. Jonathan Pierce. Family trustee. Corporate advisor. Trusted friend of her grandfather for more than 30 years. If anyone understood the true scope of the Morgan family holdings, it was him. The bailiff administered the oath. Jonathan took his seat. Judge Eleanor Hayes reviewed several documents before looking up. "Please state your name and occupation for the record." "Jonathan Pierce," he replied calmly. "I serve as managing trustee of the Morgan Family Preservation Trust and senior advisor to Morgan Strategic Holdings." The moment the company name was spoken again, another ripple moved through the courtroom. Ryan shifted uneasily. His attorney remained unusually quiet. Judge Hayes nodded. "Mr. Pierce, are you familiar with Claire Morgan?" A faint smile touched Jonathan's face. "Since the day she was born." Ryan stared at Claire. The answer immediately raised questions he had never thought to ask during 10 years of marriage. Judge Hayes continued. "Can you explain the nature of her relationship to the trust?" Jonathan opened his portfolio and removed several documents. "Claire Morgan is the primary beneficiary and controlling successor designated by the Morgan family estate plan." Ryan frowned. The words sounded important, but he still struggled to grasp their significance. "Controlling successor?" Judge Hayes repeated. "Correct." Jonathan adjusted his glasses. "The designation was established years ago and finalized through recently completed legal transitions." The courtroom remained perfectly still. Every sentence seemed to increase the tension. Claire sat calmly with her hands folded. She had heard these explanations before, yet hearing them spoken aloud inside a courtroom felt strangely surreal. Ryan suddenly leaned toward his attorney. "What does that mean?" he whispered. His attorney answered without taking his eyes off the witness. "It means she is not simply a beneficiary." "Then what is she?" The attorney hesitated. "Potentially the controlling owner." The words hit Ryan harder than he expected. Controlling owner of what? The question formed immediately in his mind. Judge Hayes asked it first. "Mr. Pierce, for clarity, what assets fall under this structure?" Jonathan glanced at the documents. "Commercial real estate holdings across multiple states. Private equity investments. Technology partnerships. Energy infrastructure interests. International investment portfolios. Several charitable foundations. Various corporate subsidiaries." Silence followed. Ryan felt his pulse quicken. The list seemed impossible. It sounded less like a trust and more like an empire. Yet Claire remained exactly as she had all morning. Composed, quiet, unmoved. Judge Hayes reviewed another page. "These holdings appear substantial." Jonathan nodded. "They are. Can you provide estimated valuation?" Ryan immediately looked up. Finally, a number. Something concrete. Something understandable. Jonathan folded his hands together before answering. "Current evaluations remain ongoing because several assets fluctuate in value. However, conservative estimates place total holdings well above previous projections." Ryan exhaled. That answer frustrated him. It sounded impressive without actually saying anything. Judge Hayes apparently felt the same. "Can you be more specific?" Jonathan looked directly at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor." He opened another folder and carefully removed a financial report. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even spectators sitting in the back rows leaned forward. "Independent analysts completed a preliminary review last month," Jonathan said. "The report estimated aggregate asset values exceeding $800 million. A stunned silence filled the room. Ryan blinked. 800 million. The number sounded absurd. Impossible. His company represented the achievement of his lifetime. Years of effort. Years of sacrifice. Years of ambition. Yet its valuation represented only a fraction of what Jonathan had just described. Judge Hayes remained professional, but even she paused briefly before continuing. 800 million? Jonathan nodded. Conservative estimates. Ryan's attorney closed his eyes for a moment. The reaction did not go unnoticed. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. Around the courtroom, people exchanged shocked looks. Some quietly whispered. Others simply stared at Claire. The woman they had assumed was financially dependent suddenly looked very different. Yet the biggest surprise had not arrived yet. Jonathan turned another page. That figure does not include several assets currently undergoing final transfer procedures. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow. Additional assets? Yes. Ryan's attorney slowly lowered his pen. How significant? Jonathan answered without hesitation. Very significant. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She already knew where this was heading. Her grandfather had warned her months earlier that pending transfers could dramatically alter valuations. She simply never imagined those discussions would become part of a public divorce hearing. Judge Hayes reviewed the next report. Her expression changed noticeably. Mr. Pierce, she said carefully, are these numbers accurate? They are. Verified? Multiple times. Ryan felt a chill move through him. The confidence he brought into court that morning had disappeared completely. He glanced toward Claire. She still was not smiling. Still was not celebrating. Still was not trying to humiliate him. Somehow that made everything worse, because it forced him to confront a possibility he had avoided for years. Maybe he never truly understood the woman he married. Jonathan closed the report and folded his hands. Your Honor, he said calmly, the court should understand that today's valuation may no longer represent the full picture. The courtroom became silent again. Judge Hayes looked up slowly. Explain. Jonathan took a measured breath. Because several newly completed transfers increase Mrs. Morgan's ownership position substantially. Ryan's heart sank. He did not know the exact number. Nobody in the room did yet. But judging from the reactions around him, one thing had become painfully clear. The revelation everyone thought they had just heard was only the beginning. For several seconds after Jonathan Pierce finished speaking, nobody in the courtroom said a word. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Ryan Morgan sat frozen in his chair, staring at the documents spread across the counsel table. $800 million. The number continued echoing through his mind. Yet, what unsettled him even more was Jonathan's final statement. The valuation was incomplete. Additional transfers were still being processed, meaning the number everyone had just heard might not even represent the true scale of Claire Morgan's holdings. Judge Eleanor Hayes slowly removed her glasses and reviewed the latest report again. She had presided over complicated financial disputes before. High-net-worth divorces, corporate ownership battles, multi-million-dollar estates. Yet this case was beginning to move into territory rarely seen in an ordinary family courtroom. Mr. Pierce, she said carefully, you indicated there are pending transfers affecting ownership percentages. Yes, Your Honor. Have those transfers been legally executed? They have. Jonathan opened another folder and removed a certified document bearing multiple signatures and official seals. The clerk accepted the papers and delivered copies to both legal teams. Ryan watched his attorney read the first page, then the second, then the third. Every page seemed to drain more color from his face. What now? Ryan whispered. The attorney hesitated before answering. You need to remain calm. Ryan almost laughed at the absurdity of the advice. Calm was becoming impossible. Across the room, Claire remained composed. She had expected this information to emerge eventually. What surprised her was how public the process had become. Years ago, her grandfather structured the family estate with long-term succession plans. The details were intentionally complex. Not to hide wealth, to protect it. Generational assets required stability, legal safeguards, strategic planning. Claire understood that responsibility even when she was young. What she never expected was becoming the central figure in those plans. Jonathan cleared his throat softly. The completed transfers increase Mrs. Morgan's ownership position in multiple entities connected to Morgan Strategic Holdings. Judge Hayes nodded. By what percentage? Jonathan glanced at the report. A controlling percentage. Several attorneys exchanged immediate looks. Ryan noticed the reaction. What does that mean? He asked aloud. This time Jonathan answered directly. It means Claire possesses authority over the majority of voting interests associated with the holding structure. Ryan stared at him. The words sounded unreal. During their marriage, he often explained business concepts to Claire as though she were a beginner. He remembered correcting her opinions during meetings, dismissing her suggestions, assuming his experience exceeded hers. Now those memories returned one after another with painful clarity. Not because Claire had argued, because she never did. She simply listened. At the time, Ryan interpreted her silence as lack of knowledge. Sitting in that courtroom, he began realizing it might have been patience. Judge Hayes reviewed another section. Mr. Pierce, does this report include current estimated valuation following the transfers? Jonathan nodded. Yes. Ryan's attorney immediately looked up. So did everyone else. The answer was sitting inside the report. Nobody had spoken it aloud yet. Jonathan waited as the judge examined the page. Her expression changed noticeably. For the first time that morning, genuine surprise crossed her face. The reaction spread through the room almost instantly. Ryan felt his pulse accelerate. Your Honor? He asked. Judge Hayes remained focused on the report. Several long seconds passed. Finally, she looked toward Jonathan. This figure has been verified? Repeatedly. By independent analysts? Yes. And legal counsel? Yes. Ryan could not take it anymore. What figure? The question echoed through the courtroom. Nobody answered immediately. Claire looked toward the large courthouse windows where afternoon sunlight had begun replacing the brightness of morning. Strange. The entire day seemed to have transformed. Earlier, Ryan believed he was the successful one, the provider, the achiever, the person whose accomplishments defined the marriage. Now he looked smaller than she had ever seen him. Not because of money, because certainty was leaving him. Judge Hayes finally set the report down. The court acknowledges preliminary valuations exceeding $1 billion. The words landed like thunder. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. $1 billion. The phrase seemed almost impossible inside the quiet courtroom. A spectator near the back visibly covered her mouth. One attorney slowly leaned back in disbelief. Even experienced professionals appeared stunned. Ryan simply stared. For several moments, he honestly wondered whether he had misheard. 1 billion. The number exceeded anything he had ever imagined associated with Claire. His company. His success. His pride. Everything he spent years building suddenly felt insignificant beside the reality, sitting only a few feet away. Yet the most remarkable person in the room remained the least reactive. Claire did not smile. She did not celebrate. She did not seek validation. She merely sat quietly, as though the announcement concerned someone else entirely. Judge Hayes eventually broke the silence. Mrs. Morgan. Claire looked up. Yes, Your Honor. Were you aware of these valuations? Claire considered the question carefully. I was aware of the assets. The exact valuation changes frequently. Another wave of disbelief moved through the room. To many people, $1 billion represented a fantasy. To Claire, it was simply a responsibility she never asked for. Jonathan gathered additional documents. There is one more matter the court should understand. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. One more matter? The phrase felt almost unbearable. How could there possibly be more? Jonathan looked toward Claire before addressing the judge. The valuation reflects ownership. It does not fully account for future succession rights. The courtroom fell silent again. Judge Hayes slowly lowered the report. Future succession rights? Jonathan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Ryan felt his stomach drop. Because if the number everyone had just heard represented only the present, he could not imagine what the future might reveal. The number lingered in the courtroom long after it was spoken. $1 billion. Even now, several people seemed unable to process it. The spectators in the back rows sat motionless. Attorneys who had entered the room expecting an ordinary divorce proceeding continued exchanging stunned looks. Ryan Morgan stared at the documents in front of him, as though they belonged to someone else. For years, he had measured success through revenue reports, quarterly growth, and business acquisitions. Yet nothing in his experience prepared him for what he was hearing now. Across the room, Claire Morgan remained calm. The attention directed toward her felt almost uncomfortable. She had spent most of her adult life avoiding exactly this situation. Wealth attracted assumptions. It created distance. It encouraged people to see numbers instead of character. That was why she had always preferred simplicity. Unfortunately, simplicity no longer existed inside that courtroom. Judge Eleanor Hayes reviewed another section of the report. "Mr. Pierce," she said carefully, "you mentioned future succession rights." Jonathan Pierce nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Please explain." Jonathan folded his hands together before answering. "The current valuation reflects assets already transferred or presently controlled by Mrs. Morgan. However, additional succession provisions remain scheduled under existing estate structures." Ryan felt his stomach tighten again. Additional. The word seemed to appear repeatedly throughout the hearing. Every time he believed he understood the full picture, another layer emerged. "What provisions?" Judge Hayes asked. Jonathan opened another file. "Several family interests remain protected through phased succession agreements. Those agreements become active under predetermined circumstances and timelines." Ryan's attorney slowly lowered his pen. "Meaning additional ownership transfers?" "Potentially significant ownership transfers," Jonathan replied. The courtroom grew quiet again. Claire closed her eyes briefly. She remembered countless conversations with her grandfather about responsibility. Never about luxury. Never about status. Responsibility. He often said wealth was not a reward. It was an obligation. The larger the resources, the greater the duty attached to them. As a child, she never fully understood those lessons. As an adult, she finally did. Judge Hayes continued examining the reports. "Mr. Pierce, can the court estimate the long-term value of these succession interests?" Jonathan hesitated for the first time. Not because he lacked an answer, because he understood the effect it would have. "The precise amount depends on future market conditions." "Understood. However, independent projections indicate substantial increases over time." Ryan laughed once. The sound carried no confidence, only disbelief. "Substantial." Jonathan looked toward him. "Yes." Ryan leaned back in his chair. Earlier that morning, he believed Claire would leave court dependent on negotiated support arrangements. The irony now felt almost unbearable. The woman he considered financially vulnerable possessed resources beyond anything he had imagined. Yet, what disturbed him most was not the money itself. It was the realization that Claire never once used it against him. 10 years together. 10 years of opportunities. She could have mentioned her family's influence countless times. She never did. She could have corrected his assumptions. She rarely bothered. She could have reminded him of her own accomplishments whenever he spoke about business success. Instead, she listened. Supported him. Encouraged him. The memory settled heavily on his conscience. Judge Hayes turned another page. "The court notes extensive charitable involvement connected to these holdings." Jonathan smiled faintly. "That is correct. Several foundations?" "More than several." Claire lowered her gaze. Those organizations mattered more to her than any valuation report. educational programs, community health initiatives, scholarship funds, housing assistance projects. Those were the parts of the family legacy she cared about most. Numbers on paper never motivated her. Impact did. Jonathan continued. Mrs. Morgan currently oversees or supports multiple philanthropic initiatives through affiliated organizations. One attorney sitting near the rear quietly shook his head in disbelief. Another made notes rapidly. Ryan noticed both reactions. For the first time, he wondered how many people in the room were reevaluating their first impression of Claire. Earlier she appeared ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. Now everyone was discovering how little appearances revealed. Judge Hayes eventually set the report aside. Mr. Pierce, one question remains. Of course, Your Honor. Why were these interests not publicly known? Jonathan glanced toward Claire before answering. Because Mrs. Morgan preferred it that way. The simplicity of the answer filled the courtroom. No elaborate legal explanation. No complex financial justification. Just a personal choice. Ryan stared at Claire. He remembered countless events where people asked about her background. She always redirected the conversation. He assumed she lacked accomplishments worth mentioning. Now he understood the truth. She simply never needed attention. The realization felt sharper than any financial revelation. Jonathan reached into his portfolio once more. There is one final document the court should review. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. Another document. Another surprise. The pattern seemed endless. Judge Hayes accepted the file and opened it. Almost immediately, her expression changed again. This time, the reaction was impossible to miss. Even Jonathan remained silent. Several seconds passed. Then the judge looked up. This was finalized recently. Yes, Your Honor. Very recently. Within the last few weeks. Ryan's attorney stood suddenly. Your Honor, may we review that document? You may. Copies were distributed across the room. Ryan watched his attorney read the first page. Then the second. His face became completely expressionless. That frightened Ryan more than anything he had seen all day. What is it? Ryan whispered. The attorney slowly lowered the papers. I think, he said quietly, we have not reached the largest revelation yet. Ryan felt his pulse quicken. Across the courtroom, Claire remained silent. Outside the courthouse windows, afternoon sunlight stretched across the city skyline. Inside, however, every person in the room sensed the same thing. The hearing had already revealed a fortune. Yet whatever sat inside that final document appeared capable of changing the entire story once again. The final document rested on Judge Eleanor Hayes's desk like an unanswered question. Every person in the courtroom seemed aware that whatever was written inside those pages carried unusual weight. Ryan Morgan watched carefully as the judge reviewed the report. Earlier that morning, he had entered the courthouse believing he understood exactly who Claire Morgan was. Now that certainty had vanished completely. Every new revelation seemed to expose another assumption he had made. Another conclusion that turned out to be wrong. Across the room, Claire remained composed. She noticed the attention from spectators. The whispers. The curious glances. The sudden respect replacing earlier indifference. None of it felt satisfying. If anything, it made her sad. Because the woman sitting in that courtroom was the same woman she had been yesterday. The same woman she had been during her marriage. The same woman people ignored before they learned about the money. Judge Hayes finally looked up from the report. Mr. Pierce, she said, this document concerns voting control. Jonathan Pierce nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And according to these records, the recent transfers did more than increase Mrs. Morgan's ownership percentage. That is correct. Ryan felt his chest tighten. He no longer knew what to expect. Every answer seemed to create a larger question. Judge Hayes continued reading. The transfer also consolidated decision-making authority. Jonathan folded his hands. Yes. Meaning Mrs. Morgan now controls the majority voting position across the holding structure? She does. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Several attorneys immediately began making notes. Others simply stared at Claire. Ryan could not look away. He remembered countless business dinners during their marriage. Times he spoke proudly about board votes and shareholder approvals. Moments he explained corporate governance as though Claire had little interest in the subject. The irony felt almost painful now. Claire had spent years quietly connected to a level of business influence far beyond anything he achieved. Yet she never once used it to make herself feel superior. Judge Hayes reviewed another section. The report indicates effective control over multiple subsidiary entities. Jonathan nodded. Dozens! And those entities collectively operate across several industries? Yes. Ryan's attorney slowly leaned back in his chair. His expression suggested he had stopped trying to predict what came next. The courtroom had moved beyond ordinary expectations hours ago. Jonathan opened another file. For clarity, Your Honor, the significance of these transfers extends beyond valuation. Explain. Jonathan glanced briefly toward Claire before continuing. The Morgan family structure was designed to preserve long-term continuity. Ownership is important. Governance is equally important. Judge Hayes nodded. Meaning? Mrs. Morgan is no longer simply the beneficiary of wealth. Silence followed. Ryan felt his pulse quicken. Jonathan's next words landed with unmistakable force. She is now the principal decision-maker. The room froze. Even people who struggled to understand financial terminology recognized the importance of that statement. Claire was not merely wealthy. She was the person making decisions affecting an enormous business empire. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. For years, he believed leadership belonged to him. He built a company, managed employees, negotiated contracts, directed growth. Those accomplishments once defined his identity. Yet sitting in that courtroom, he began understanding something uncomfortable. Leadership was not measured by how loudly someone spoke. Sometimes it was measured by how quietly they carried responsibility. Claire had spent years carrying responsibilities he never even knew existed. Judge Hayes continued reviewing the report. There is also a letter attached. Jonathan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Signed by the board? Unanimously. The judge opened the letter and read silently for several moments. Then she looked toward Claire. Her expression softened slightly. Mrs. Morgan. Claire raised her eyes. Yes, Your Honor. This letter confirms your appointment as chair of Morgan Strategic Holdings. The silence that followed felt absolute. No whispers. No movement. Nothing. Ryan stared at Claire. Chair. The word echoed louder than any valuation figure. $1 billion was impressive. A title like this represented something different. Trust. Authority. Influence. Responsibility. Claire herself seemed almost uncomfortable hearing it spoken publicly. She remembered the board meeting only weeks earlier. The discussions. The votes. The expectations placed upon her. She accepted the position not because she wanted power, but because her grandfather believed she was ready. At the time, she viewed it as a private family matter. Now it had become courtroom testimony. Judge Hayes carefully folded the letter. Congratulations, Mrs. Morgan. Claire offered a polite nod. Thank you. Ryan looked down at his hands. Earlier that morning he laughed. He remembered the sound clearly now. The confidence. The certainty. The assumption that Claire would leave court diminished while he walked away victorious. That version of reality felt impossible. Around him, The entire courtroom seemed to view Claire differently. Not because she changed, because their understanding finally had. Jonathan gathered his documents and prepared to step down. Before doing so, he turned toward the judge one final time. "There is one additional matter." Ryan nearly closed his eyes. "Another one." Judge Hayes gestured for him to continue. Jonathan removed a sealed letter from his portfolio. Unlike the previous reports, this document carried a distinctive family seal embossed in gold. Claire immediately recognized it. Her breath caught for the first time all day. Judge Hayes noticed. "What is this?" Jonathan answered quietly. "A personal directive left by Charles Morgan before his passing." Claire's grandfather. The founder. The architect of everything. The courtroom became silent once more. Because suddenly the hearing was no longer about money. It was about legacy. And judging from the expression on Claire's face, whatever was written inside that final letter might change everything yet again. The gold seal on the envelope seemed to capture every eye in the courtroom. For the first time since the hearing began, Claire Morgan felt her composure waver slightly. Not because she feared what was inside. Because she knew exactly whose words waited on those pages. Charles Morgan. Her grandfather. The man who taught her that character mattered more than wealth. The man who spent a lifetime building an empire while constantly reminding his family that money alone could never define success. Jonathan Pierce carefully handed the sealed letter to Judge Eleanor Hayes. The courtroom remained completely silent. Even Ryan Morgan, who had spent much of the morning reacting to one revelation after another, sat motionless. Something about the letter felt different from the financial reports. Different from ownership percentages. Different from valuations. This was personal. Judge Hayes examined the seal briefly before opening the envelope. Inside was a single folded document. She began reading quietly. Seconds passed. Then another minute. The room waited. The judge's expression changed gradually. Not surprised this time. Something softer. More reflective. Eventually she looked up. "Mr. Pierce, was this intended to remain confidential?" Jonathan nodded. "Under normal circumstances, yes." "Then why present it today?" Jonathan glanced toward Claire. "Because the circumstances are no longer normal." Ryan watched the exchange carefully. He had spent hours learning about trusts, holdings, corporate structures, and financial authority. Yet somehow this simple letter felt more significant than all of it. Judge Hayes lowered her eyes and continued reading. Claire remembered the day her grandfather wrote it. He was older then. Slower. The energy that once filled every room had softened into quiet wisdom. During one of their final conversations, he sat beside her in the library overlooking the family estate. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Afternoon sunlight illuminated dust floating through the air. He asked her a question she never forgot. "If everything disappeared tomorrow, who would you be?" Claire spent several moments thinking before answering. "The same person." Her grandfather smiled. "Then you are ready." At the time, she did not fully understand what he meant. Now, years later, she finally did. Judge Hayes cleared her throat softly. "The court would like clarification regarding one passage." Jonathan nodded. "Of course. Mr. Morgan's name is referenced." Ryan immediately looked up. His own name. Inside a letter written by a man he had never met. The realization caught him off guard. Jonathan remained calm. "Yes." Judge Hayes looked toward Ryan briefly before continuing. "The author writes that future partners, associates, and family members should never be evaluated by their ability to create wealth." The courtroom remained silent. Every word seemed to carry unusual weight. "He writes that true character reveals itself through how people treat others when they believe no advantage can be gained." Ryan lowered his eyes. The word struck harder than any financial figure. Because they touched something money never could. Behavior. Choices. Respect. Claire sat quietly. She remembered hearing similar lessons throughout her childhood. Her grandfather repeated them often. Success revealed capability. Character revealed identity. Judge Hayes continued reading. The letter further states that the greatest inheritance provided to Claire Morgan is not financial. It is the freedom to remain kind in a world that rewards arrogance. Several people exchanged thoughtful looks. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed again. Earlier the room focused on wealth. Now the focus shifted towards something else entirely. Jonathan folded his hands together. Charles Morgan believed deeply in that principle. Ryan stared at the table in front of him. Images from the marriage surfaced one after another. The jokes he dismissed as harmless. The moments he interrupted Claire during conversations. The assumptions he made about her intelligence. The growing habit of measuring people according to achievement rather than character. At the time, those actions felt insignificant. Sitting here now, they felt impossible to ignore. Judge Hayes eventually folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. A remarkable document. Jonathan nodded. He was a remarkable man. The judge looked toward Claire. Mrs. Morgan. Claire raised her eyes. Yes, Your Honor. Your grandfather appears to have been very proud of you. For the first time all day, genuine emotion crossed Claire's face. She smiled softly. I hope so. The answer lingered in the room. Not because of sadness. Because it felt sincere. Jonathan then removed one final document from his portfolio. Unlike the others, it contained only a few pages. There is one last matter requiring acknowledgement. Ryan almost laughed from exhaustion. One last matter. The phrase had appeared repeatedly throughout the hearing. Yet, judging by Jonathan's tone, this truly was the final revelation. Judge Hayes accepted the papers. Her eyes moved across the page. Then she paused. This was executed 6 months ago? Yes, Your Honor. And became effective immediately? Correct. Claire looked toward Jonathan. She recognized the document instantly. Her heart skipped once. Not because it involved money. Because it involved purpose. Judge Hayes reviewed the final page. Then she slowly looked up. Mrs. Morgan. Claire straightened slightly. Yes. The judge's expression softened once again. It appears the largest commitment attached to your inheritance was never intended for you personally. Confusion spread across the courtroom. Ryan looked up immediately. Jonathan smiled faintly. No, Your Honor. Then who was it intended for? Jonathan answered quietly. The people she chooses to help. And suddenly, for the first time that day, the conversation was no longer about what Claire owned. It was about what she planned to do with it. The courtroom remained quiet after Jonathan Pierce spoke those final words. The people she chooses to help. Somehow that sentence carried more weight than every valuation report presented throughout the day. For hours, the hearing had revolved around numbers. Ownership percentages. Corporate authority. Financial disclosures. Yet in a single moment, the focus shifted towards something far more meaningful. Purpose. Judge Eleanor Hayes carefully reviewed the final document before placing it beside the letter from Charles Morgan. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting warm afternoon light across the polished wood surfaces. The hearing was nearing its end. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different from the one that existed that morning. Ryan Morgan sat silently. The man who entered the courtroom with confidence and certainty now looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. He stared at the table in front of him, replaying years of memories through a new lens. He remembered every occasion he underestimated Claire. Every time he dismissed her perspective. Every moment he assumed success belonged only to the person receiving public recognition. Sitting there now, he understood how little he had truly seen. Across the room, Claire remained calm. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Simply calm. The revelations had surprised everyone except her, yet she felt no satisfaction watching people change their opinions. Because the most important truth remained unchanged. She was still the same person she had been before anyone knew about the money. Judge Hayes finally closed the final folder. "The court has reviewed the submitted materials." Her voice echoed gently through the chamber. Every person listened carefully. "The evidence clearly establishes Mrs. Morgan's independent financial position, ownership interests, and corporate authority." Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. Hearing the facts summarized aloud made everything feel even more real. The judge continued. "However, what stands out most is not the scale of the assets involved." The room remained silent. "It is the fact that these assets existed long before this proceeding began." Several people exchanged thoughtful glances. The observation carried obvious implications. Claire had never acquired wealth after the marriage ended. She had entered the marriage already connected to it. Ryan felt the truth settle heavily inside him. For years he believed he was the provider, the successful spouse, the person creating opportunities. Yet the woman sitting across from him had never needed his success to validate her own value. Judge Hayes looked toward Claire. "Mrs. Morgan, is there anything you wish to add before we conclude?" The courtroom waited. Claire looked down at the worn leather folder resting on her lap. The same folder she carried into court that morning. The same folder everyone ignored while focusing on Ryan. Slowly she stood. Every eye followed her. She could have discussed the assets, the trusts, the holdings, the billion-dollar valuation. Instead, her answer was simple. "No, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Nothing at all?" Claire smiled softly. "I believe everything important has already been said." The response surprised many people. Yet Jonathan Pierce smiled knowingly. Charles Morgan would have approved. Judge Hayes nodded respectfully. "Very well." Moments later, the hearing officially concluded. Papers were gathered. Documents organized. Conversations slowly resumed throughout the courtroom. The legal process was ending. People began standing from their seats. Some attorneys approached Jonathan with questions. Others quietly discussed the extraordinary testimony they had witnessed. Ryan remained seated. For a long moment, he simply watched Claire. Eventually, he stood and took several steps toward her. Not because he wanted money. Not because he suddenly cared about the valuation. Because he needed to say something. "Claire." She turned. Her expression remained kind. That somehow made everything harder. Ryan hesitated before speaking. "I was wrong." The words hung between them. No audience. No performance. Just honesty. Claire studied him quietly. "About what?" Ryan exhaled slowly. "About a lot of things." She said nothing. Ryan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "I spent years measuring people by achievements I could see." His voice softened. "I never understood everything you were carrying." Claire listened. "I know." There was no bitterness in her answer. No anger. Only truth. Ryan nodded. For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to continue. Then he stopped. Some conversations arrived too late. Both people understood that. "I hope you are happy," he said finally. Claire smiled. A genuine smile. "I am." Ryan nodded once. The answer seemed to bring him both sadness and peace at the same time. Then he stepped aside. No dramatic farewell. No desperate attempt to change the past. Just acceptance. Claire picked up her folder and walked toward the courthouse exit. Jonathan Pierce followed several steps behind. Outside, the late afternoon sun illuminated the city streets. The air felt warmer than it had that morning. As she stepped through the courthouse doors, she paused briefly and looked toward the skyline. Her grandfather's words returned one final time. "If everything disappeared tomorrow, who would you be?" Claire smiled. She knew the answer now better than ever. She would still be herself. The wealth never defined her. The titles never defined her. The inheritance never defined her. Character did. Compassion did. Purpose did. Behind her, the courthouse doors slowly closed. Ahead of her, an entirely new chapter waited. Not one built on revenge. Not one built on proving anyone wrong. One built on freedom. As Claire Morgan walked into the sunlight, she carried something far more valuable than a fortune. She carried peace. And in the end, the billion-dollar assets shocked the courtroom. But her dignity changed the story.